The concept of nature. These are Turner lectures delivered at Trinity College by Alfred North Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead was one of the eminent philosophers of 20th century. Not only philosophers, he was a mathematician. So the sort of lectures I want to just uh, the interlude, the brief of the topics which are contained in the book covered a wide spectrum of ideas. Not only ideas, uh, the interesting part of the book, these lectures, is that he has Albert North Whitehead in a uniquely original way has tried to develop a metaphysics or an epistemology, which in his own words, what he the aim of his this book is, the object of present volume and its predecessor is to lay basis of a natural philosophy which is necessary presupposition of reorganized speculative physics. So in this he was not so he had the peculiarity of Whitehead was that the times in which he was living it, that general theory of relativity had was a celebrated success. The celebrated success of relativity. So in the words of Albert Einstein, when somebody said him, what if the expedition of 1919, the perihelion of Mercury and other observational aspects of general relativity were not found true? So Einstein famously remarked that God, it could not have been wrong. So he had a belief in a particular mathematical structure, which ultimately uh, led to a formulation or results which were ultimately tested by the observational aspects of astronomy. It had later many aspects also. The the results of general theory of relativity have absorbed minds, physicists, mathematicians, mathematical relativists since 1920s to up to this time, to just uncover the very subtleties of those equations. But how Einstein arrived at that sophisticated theory of general theory of relativity? So at that time, even famous Eddington famously also remarked that only two, if there are, he famously said, if there are two who knows general theory of relativity, there are two person who is the third person. So the technical mastery of tensors at that time was very, but I would not was very, it was very formidable at that time. But maybe people were not that much the underlying philosophy or underlying metaphysics, which Einstein himself did not emphasize that much on it. Maybe unconsciously he might have been influenced by German thinkers like Immanuel Kant or Schelling, by German a particular discourse which was developing in those times. But Einstein as such did not emphasize that he might have been unconsciously, his metaphysics or his philosophy, he might have unconsciously absorbed those elements of Spinoza or Kant, but he was not very emphatic in emphasizing these facts. What are the metaphysical or philosophical roots of mathematical theory of relativity? So in this background, maybe Alfred North Whitehead was not comfortable with this sort of affairs. He is in this book also. He is very much appreciative of, not only in this book, there is another the book Mathematical Theory of Relativity. In both these books, he is very much appreciative of the geniusness or the brilliance of Einstein in discovering a result. But somehow he is he is not appreciative of the fact that, in his own words, what he says that but in my judgment, he has cramped the development of his brilliant mathematical method in the narrow bounds of a very doubtful philosophy. So he is not convinced by the underlying philosophical. So Albert Einstein was not philosopher in the technical sense of the word, but somehow he might have unconsciously uh, imbibed certain things which he would not have considered, uh, which we are not, he might not have in a way. Well, or normal working physicists or professional physicists or relativists are not interested in those subtler points. But Alfred North Whitehead, being a philosopher and mathematician par excellence, he not only had a particular viewpoint in mathematics, how to view mathematics, he also, in this, the way he has a particular, he wants to have the reason, uh, he wants to have a natural philosophy which will reorganize speculative physics. He wants to have his own way of his own episteme, how to view foundations of physics also. So it's a very, these the books, so how he arrives, how he just explains those views of his which differ from Einstein in certain subtler, so one subtler ways. But before he goes on to do that, he has slowly and progressively explained, for example, what is nature of thought, for example. So what is knowledge, what is nature, and in this sense he has very much what we construe as nature, or what we construe as space and time, and thereof. So fundamentally, what is space and what is time, or what is space time, which was an invocation of relativity, which was a departure from Newtonian time thinking, time independent of space. So can we imagine space without time? Can we imagine time without space? Or can space and time have an independent existence? And what do you mean by space and time, viewing space and time as events, as together? So these are fundamental questions. So the advent of special theory of relativity or general theory of relativity forced us to construct or imagine the reality of universe or reality of space time in a certain perspective. So what Albert North Whitehead has done, he has tried to understand space and time. He just appreciates space time in the relativistic sense, but he rather reconstructs in these Turner lectures the idea of time and space right from the Greeks. How we try to imagine space and how we try to imagine time, and whether the idea of can there be one space, or there can be many spaces in which you can have a different idea of space, or is there one time or there are many times, or how we can reconstruct space times in the various spaces and in the various times. So those lead to conclusions which are maybe startling for some, maybe absurd for some, because people who are hardcore relativists, they have a certain understanding of how they understand space and how they understand time in a certain relativistic sense of space time. But in this, for example, before I'm going to discuss these points or allude to them, I would rather just verbatim quote many sentences of this book and somehow try to understand what Whitehead meant when he talks of these statements of nature, space, time. perception, sense perceptions, cognition, and our understanding of them. For example, he says, for example, how does he construct knowledge? Thus, there are three components of in our knowledge of nature, namely fact, factors, and entities. Fact is the undifferentiated terminus of terminus of terminus of sense awareness. Factors are termini of sense awareness differentiated as elements of facts. Entities are factors in their function as the termini of thought. So when we speak of nature as a complex of related entities, the complex is a fact as an entity of thought, to whose bare individuality is ascribed the property of embracing in its complexity and natural entity. So it is our business to analyze these conceptions, and in this course of this analysis, space and time should appear together. So you cannot understand space and time, you will also understand matter. For example, when he talks of matter, he says the history of doctrine of matter has yet to be written. It is history of influence of Greek philosophy on science. So that influence has issued a long misconception of metaphysical status of natural entities. So Plato and Aristotle found Greek thought preoccupied with the quest for simple substances in terms of which the course of events could be expressed. We may formulate this state of mind in a question, what is nature made up of? The answer which their genius gave to this question, and more particularly the concept which underlie the terms in which they are framed their answers, had determined the unquestioned presuppositions as to time, space, and matter, which have reigned in science. So in a particular way, he describes space is not merely ordering of material entities, so that any one entity bears a certain relations to other material entities. So it is not merely what he is saying. So space is more than that. In the same sense, he is saying time in current philosophy does not exert the same disintegrating effect as matter which occupies it. So in a way, he gives indictment to Greek philosophy which somehow developed in the wrong way. Not only space, time, and matter, somehow they are also related. For example, when he talks of a theory, in theory of bifurcation of churches, for example, he talks of causality, he talks of time, space. So these questions, delusions, these questions are not really separable. So episteme, he is developing that he is finding the questions of causality, time, space, they are all somewhat interrelated. And the underlying, for example, he quotes, so if they are related, but so what he constructs as science, for example, there can be no explanation of why of the knowledge, we can only describe what of knowledge, namely we can analyze content and its internal relations, but we cannot explain why there is knowledge. The causal nature is a metaphysical chimera. So there is a need of metaphysics whose scope transcends limitations of nature. The object of such a metaphysical science is not to explain knowledge, but exhibit in its utmost completeness our concept of reality. So in a sense, he is also trying to speak what how we fundamentally. So there have been various theories of science also. What is fundamentally science? From Popper to Kuhn to Poincaré to Eddington, there are why you, what are the in Fermanville, there are motivations of doing science, or what is science fundamentally, from aesthetic reasons to utilitarian reasons to pragmatic reasons. So there are various schools of philosophy. Why science, or what is science? So in he wants to, so what he's saying, he's trying to reconstruct what how he's saying that science is not discussing the causes of knowledge, which I was, but the coherence of knowledge. The understanding which is sought by science is an understanding of relations within nature. So, so how we basically, according to Whitehead, it's more he's more interested in organizing the structure of knowledge in a certain way rather than what that knowledge is in its own self. So how you can organize that structure of knowledge and what its relation is to us. So in that he is coming, for example, closer to the empiricists. For example, in the philosophy of nature, I consider the subject object called nature in its activity of self reconstructing. In order to understand, we must rise to intellectual intuition of nature. The empiricist doesn't rise there too, and for this reason, all his explanation is always he himself that proves to be constructing nature. It is no wonder that his construction and that which was to be constructed so seldom coincide. So he somehow militates the idea of totally being totally empiricist. So the object of knowledge and the subject of knowledge. So so the object the, and subject of knowledge for the perceiver don't match in the Whiteheadian sense. So he would rather no he would not be an empiricist. So he has some problem with empiricism as a philosophy of science. So at the end, he would, for example, even the Platonic doctrine of so in the so at the end he would say, I submit to you among the necessary prologmena for philosophy and for natural science is a thorough understanding of types of entities and types of relations among those entities which are disclosed to us in the perceptions of nature. So now I come to his definition of how he understands time. This third chapter. So in the discussion, he is talking of so time. For example, there are various understanding. One is relativistic time, where time cannot imagine time without space, and vice versa. And there is a Newtonian time, where time was something which mm, it was simultaneous. It was uh, time had an independent existence of space, and it was uniformly flowing at all points in space and at the same value. And there was a seriality associated to it, the way we construct past, present, and future. So relativity had some related to Toasters that you cannot think of space without an understanding of time. There were some developments in electrodynamics and special theory of relativity, which necessitated a certain understanding of time, which understanding of time which was not independent of space. So we have a word, something called space-time, invoked by Minkowski. So in that space-time, there are also some notions of simultaneity and other things, which is a very important idea. So here Whitehead is somewhat uh, he invokes a term called instantaneousness. So he wants to distinguish simultaneity with instantaneousness. So what he simultaneity you can understand. You can you imagine try to imagine 2 points in space. They have their own understanding of time, which depends upon where they are located in space. So there are some transformation equations if they want to agree. Lorentz transformation on a given event for a given event. But we don't experience simultaneity as such. Normally, as human consciousness, we talk of instantaneousness. Also, how instantaneousness is different from simultaneity. So, instantaneous for him is a concept of all nature at an instant, where an instant is conceived as deprived of all temporal extension. So, we have an understanding of time. The word instantaneous means that a temporal extension. It's neither going forward, neither it's going backward. It is in the now of the moment. Now of the moment. So the temporal order of time, for example, when we talk of time, instantaneousness of time. So how it is different from the succession. So how to try to imagine the an event. So in succession of events, so at every point there is an instantaneousness. So the evolution of time from past, present to future. So instantaneousness of time and temporality of time. So there are some. So he has delved in these ideas. So one good sentence he has written is that we first have to make up our minds whether time is to be found in nature or nature is to be found in time. So the difficulty of later alternative, namely of making time prior to nature, is that time when becomes a becomes a metaphysical enigma. So before I'm going to elucidate on this idea of time, so what he is talking of materialism as a philosophy, which has been, for example, not only were men of science materialists, but also adherent to all schools of philosophy. The aligned idealists only differed from philosophical materialists on the question of alignment of nature in reference to mind. So, in a sense, he is trying to have a value neutral ground for the materiality of the knowledge. So, there can be all epistemes which can, there can be various philosophies which can arrive at scientific materialism, which explains for us the apparent or the world which we are observing. So, he wants to have some consensus for natural materialism. So, so for that he would want to have, for example, there should be there are three ideas or trinity. How we can appreciate matter in space and time. So he says that what is the trinity of temporal series of extensionless instants, of aggregate of material entities, of space which is the outcome of relations of matter. So, but he is saying there is a wide gap between presuppositions of intellectual theory of materialism and the immediate deliverance of sense awareness. So, So I would further just want to discuss on this the that somehow we would want to say that no true physical science which looks first at mathematics for the provision of conceptual model. Such a procedure is to repeat the errors of logicians of Middle East. So he would want to have an independent and foundations of science which is independent of mathematical methodology. The way I was talking of space times, so the Whiteheadian, the Whiteheadian philosophy is a very, it's a terse, in a terse mathematical way. He has also arrived at Einsteinian equations, but according to him, he also explains in his mathematical theory of relativity. He explains a lot of experimental facts which are also observant in general theory of relativity. So why should we appreciate Whiteheadian formalism more as compared to the Einsteinian formalism? So he has devoted in mathematical theory of relativity, he has given the reasons that there is something called heterogeneity of ideas. He wants to somehow, he is somehow he wants to somehow depart from Einstein in a subtle way. For example, he says that the character of time and space is not in essence a priori. The essential relatedness of any perceived field of events to all other events require that this relatedness of all events should conform to a sustained disclosure derived from limited fold. So the doctrine leads to the rejection of Einstein's interpretation of his formula and as expressing a causal heterogeneity of spatio-temporal warping dependent upon contingent executives. So one novelty about Alfred North Whitehead is that he has talked of something called bifurcation theory in nature. The way how the cognitive element, what are sense perceptions, and how do we construct space time as an event, so and how he has some underlying notions of, for example, he talks of equality, he talks of congruence, and those primitive notions which we take as self-evident truths of Euclidean geometry or non-Euclidean geometry, those a priori truths. So he wants to revisit these notions of equality, congruence, space, and time in his constructions of, not only there can be one space, there can be many spaces, and how you can have congruences among the various spaces, and so there can be many times also, and how we can imagine space time in regard to these different spaces and different times. So one conclusion is that he could derive Einsteinian relativity in a certain way. So his formalism has also some another, they have also applications which somehow in a subtle way deviate from. You could derive perihelion of deviation of perihelion of Mercury and other things, but there are some other practical facts, some other deviations in terms of predictions. So essential aim of Whitehead is to say that one should also be conscious of the metaphysical and epistemological foundations underlying the science which you are doing, and those, even though success, pragmatic success of logical positivism or empiricism, the way which has dominated the scientific philosophy, eh, is good thing. He is not in a sense critiquing that. He's appreciative also of that to some extent, but he is also trying to reconstruct the underlying notions of looking at space and time, not in strict sense, looking at space and time with regard to our cognition, with regard to the way we construct space, time, and matter, not purely also in terms of the relativistic sense. So he has developed a whole epistemology or philosophy for which we can philosophy, epistemology, and philosophy for whole epistemology, uh, which goes on to dig these notions of congruence, equality, with the notions of space and time, which may be alternate in their existence. So the foundations of space. So what Einsteinian theory doesn't describe time, what time is. It is a theory of measurement of time. So what time is a more subtle idea. What is time in its existence? Can we think of space without time, or time without space? Or so these questions, thinking them in terms of a certain through a philosophical or reconstructing these questions. So he has done, according to my understanding, there is a lot of effort how he has tried to dig it from Greeks to different schools of philosophy. So that is one of the maybe a lot of that's one of the contribution of that is the way I Whitehead looked at philosophy, of how he looked at uh, his to end it, how he wanted to, for example, he wanted to for according, I would just rephrase his words. The object of present volume and its predecessor is to lay the basis of a natural philosophy, which is a necessary presupposition of a reorganized speculative physics. So that was his aim. Thanks.